Hi there, I'm Eitan, and welcome back to wixWiz. In this video, we're going to be talking about rendering on Wix, and we're going to be learning about the two different times that Wix essentially renders the page and code for your website, and that is the server and on the client side, or backend and front end, or backend and browser. And we have a way using the rendering API to tap into that rendering environment and also prevent some issues that can happen when accessing or storing data in both states. So if you're interested in learning more about that, let's get started. So before we start off testing, let's talk a bit about what rendering is and how Wix renders our websites. And I'm really just basing this off this article here, Velo, about the page rendering process. Some of the stuff here are a little outdated, but in general, this explains to us that Wix renders every single page in two stages. So first it does server-side rendering, and then it runs client-side rendering, which is in your browser. And Wix websites, if you're not familiar, are built as single-page applications. So that means that the server-side rendering happens when you first visit your website, and the client-side rendering happens when you visit every single page. And if your if your Wix website is built with no code, then you won't even notice this. But once you start using Velo code in your website, then there are some things that can come up that may even cause issues because of this double rendering. And I'm going to go over to our site now and demonstrate one of these things, which you might have run into. So what I'm going to be doing here on the home page, I have a simple onReady function here, and what we're going to do is we're just going to insert some data into this demo collection. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to import Wix data, and here, as soon as we run this onReady function, I'm going to create a wrapper function. I'm going to call it insert demo data, and this is going to be an asynchronous function because we're inserting into a collection. And I'm just going to call a simple insert, so const inserted item will be equal to await wixdata.insert, and we're going to be inserting to the demo collection. And this is a collection which only has a title field. So I'm just going to say, whoops, the field will be title, and I'm just going to insert test into the title field. And why is this throwing an error for me? Oh, sorry, because I put a comma. This should be like this. Okay, excellent. So this will insert into our demo, and I've already set the permissions so that anybody can insert into this collection. And let's call this function right over here. So insert demo data. So now, if you didn't know anything about rendering, what you would expect is that this will insert one item with the title test into our collection. But if I go ahead and publish my site, and let's view the site. Okay, great. So our page loaded and we don't see anything going on, but our data has been inserted in the background. So let's go back to our editor and check out the demo collection. I'm going to go over here, open, whoops, not that, open collection. And you can see here that test has been inserted very many times. So let me just get rid of that here. I'm going to delete all of those. And I'm going to load my page one more time. So here is the home page. I'm going to load it one more time. And let's check out our demo collection. And you can see here that test has been inserted twice. The 6 tests that we saw before, what I'm guessing is that is from different server-side rendering that Wix does when the site is published, possibly for the first time or published at all, which is a whole nother issue with this that I just discovered during this tutorial. But what I wanted to demonstrate was this, that we actually receive two tests, even though we only run insert once in our code. And that is because one of them is from the server-side rendering and the other is from the client-side rendering. And I'm going to prove that to you. I'm going to go over here and I'm going to say text and I'm going to say rendering. Okay, so I'm adding a new field here for rendering. And I'm going to get rid of these two that we have over here. And now we're going to talk a little bit about how to differentiate and split between the two rendering stages. And that is why we have this rendering API in the Velo API. And we have our environment. And if we tap into wixWindow.rendering.env, then we will get either browser or backend. Let me zoom in a little bit. I'm going to go back to env. So we get either backend or browser. Okay, so what I'm going to do is here in my insert item code. So instead of just inserting title over here, what we'll also do is we'll import wixWindow. Window, and I'm going to say const to insert, just to make it a little more organized. We'll have title test, and here we'll have rendering, which is the new field that I just added. And here we'll have wixWindow dot rendering dot end. And now hopefully when we actually run this code, when it's run on the server side, we will see backend here. And when it's run on the client side, this should be browser. And I'm just going to pass this here instead of our title, so to insert. And I'm just going to double check to make sure. Yeah, so rendering, excellent. So let's go ahead and publish this. And let me just make sure that we didn't get more stray insertions here in our collection. Okay, so our collection here is clean and empty. So let's go ahead and reload our site. So I'm just going to do a hard refresh here. And now let's head back to the editor and check out demo. And you can see here that we have two tests, and one is from browser and one is from backend. So that is an excellent demonstration of the server-side and client-side rendering with Wix. And in order to solve this problem, so let's say I don't want to insert this twice, I only want to insert this once. So I can decide if I want to insert it on client side or on the server side, and just add a condition. So here I can just say if, let's say Wix window dot rendering dot env equals to backend, then return. Okay, and don't execute the rest of this function. And now if I go ahead and I publish this, and I load my site one more time, then open collection, and you can see here that we only have the test from the browser. Okay, these are from my previous test. So this is great for preventing this kind of issue, which can come up. And it's also important for performance, because you can imagine that if we're doing certain very time-consuming actions, such as querying data or getting data from an external API on the back end and on the front end, then that's double the time. And we're slowing down the load time of our website and the time for a full render of our website. So let's do a few experiments and see how we can speed up the rendering time of our site by using either just back end or just front end, just client side, and see how loading the data on server side or on client side affects how the data is shown and attached to different Wix elements that are on our page. So for this next experiment, I've gone ahead and cleared out all the previous code that we wrote, and I've also added a simple repeater, which I called mock data repeater. And within each item, I added just a text box where we'll be displaying the first name from our mock data collection. So what I'm going to do is two things. One is we're going to have a function that will load our data. So const load data. And this is just going to query our data set and get all of the items in it. There are approximately 1,000 items. So I'm just going to say const mock data query result. And this will be await data dot query. And we're going to be querying the mock data collection. And I'm just going to do find. And I'm also going to add a limit here of 1,000, which is the most that you can do within limit, if I'm not mistaken. And this will mean that we'll get about 1,000 items back um, instead of just 50 or 100, whatever the default is. And then I'm going to say const mock data equals to mock data query result dot items. And then we're going to assign this as the data to our repeater. So I'm going to say const, sorry, not const, but I'm going to select our repeater element. So mock data repeater dot data equals to mock data. And in order for this to work, we're going to have to tell our repeater how to behave when it is given data. So I'm going to create a new function, and this is going to be load repeater. And this is just going to contain our on item ready for the repeater. So we have mock data repeater and then just the on item ready with the callback function. And this callback function takes item and it's item data. It could also take index, but for now, we don't really need that. And then I'm just going to assign, so this is going to be item over here. And here I'm going to select the text first name, okay, which is this text box inside of the item. And I'm going to assign the item data dot first name field to it. And you can see here, these are the names of the fields. So I'm just assigning this first name to each first name text box inside of the repeater. And what we're going to try and do here is we're going to see how loading different parts of this, either in the front end or the back end, affects the functionality of the website. So what I'm going to do is add an if statement here. So if wixWindow dot environment, dot rendering dot environment equals to backend, then we're going to do X, and else we are going to do something else. So let's start off by rendering everything inside of the backend. Okay, so I'm going to do here load repeater, so giving the instructions to the repeater, and load data over here in the back end. And I'm going to go ahead and publish this and go ahead and view site. And I'm just going to go to the page where I have my repeater. I can even go ahead and refresh that. And we can see that essentially the repeater is not being populated with data. Okay, so on the back end, I cannot give the on item ready command to the repeater, and I cannot assign it with data. And if I switch, let's say, just this load data to the front end, okay, let's see how that affects it. So I'm going to go ahead and publish, and let's try rendering. Okay, so here what happened is we essentially did manage to assign the data to the repeater, but this did not work. So let's see. So that was a very interesting phenomenon. So we did assign the data, but this that was supposed to run in the back end essentially didn't run. And obviously, if we move both of these only to the front end, then hit publish and give it another spin, then here we get the expected result where everything essentially loads. So we see here that these two, there's no real reason to be loading them in the back end, and essentially we could only be loading them in the front end. The question is does this improve performance or not? So the next thing that we're going to do is run a few experiments and see if the load time of our website speeds up if we are only loading our data in the front end as opposed to in the front end and in the back end. So in order to test performance, what I did is I tried loading the repeater and the data, both in the back end and front end, and then only in the front end. And I also did it once with a timeout to kind of exaggerate the situation. And in total, I ran 4 experiments. So experiment number 1 was just plain browser and backend doing a regular query. Experiment 2 was browser only. And then experiment 3 was with the timeout. And experiment 4 was browser only with the timeout. And I did it using the Google PageSpeed Insights. And what I found is that in general, the desktop loading times weren't very different. Okay, so the desktop was pretty much the same. You can see also the performance scores are the same. So this is experiment number 1. This is experiment number 2. And in experiment number 3 and 4, it's interesting to see that delaying the loading of the data actually improved the performance rating of the page. That's an interesting insight, which is unrelated to the rendering, but that's just something that I noticed doing this test at the moment. And the second thing is that the mobile actually did show some differences. So if we just take a look at it over here, in experiments 1 and 2, the blocking time was a lot more on the experiment number 1. So that means when we were doing both browser and backend. And that same goes for the mobile of the experiment number 3, where we were also doing the mobile and backend, but this time with the timeout. Whereas if we take a look at mobile of experiment 4, we see that the blocking time is super low. So it does seem to be affecting this blocking time. And if we go into expand view here, it sums up all the time periods between FCP and time to interactive. So that's just one metric here, but in terms of some of the other metrics, we didn't see such a big difference. So you see 2.3 seconds to contentful paint. The second one was 1.2, so that's also quite an improvement. Largest contentful paint was pretty much the same, and layout shift was 0. We were looking mostly at speeds, so I would conclude that based on this one experiment, which is quite superficial, obviously you need to do a lot more testing in order to prove anything in this sense. But it does seem that loading only in the browser does improve the loading speeds for mobile. So that's something that you might want to look into if you're trying to improve the mobile speeds of your website. This isn't something that I'm taking out of the Wix documentation or Wix recommendations. This is just kind of me playing around and trying different things. Because if we take a look at the actual documentation, where we have something here called warm-up data. So this is actually also part of the rendering API. And this is supposed to allow you to load the code or do querying in the backend and then send that information to the front end. So essentially also only doing it on one side. So only loading the data in the server side, for example, and then passing it to the client side using this get and set method. Unfortunately, I tried this quite thoroughly. Maybe I'll add some of the clips from my attempts in the bloopers here after this video. But my only conclusion is that this does not work. It was consistently returning undefined for me, and I'm quite sure that I set it up correctly. If anybody from Wix is watching, this would be a great time to take a look into this or prove me wrong. If any of the other viewers has managed to get this to work, please get in touch with me. I'd love to hear how you did it. But my conclusion is that this essentially doesn't work. And yeah, you can also take a look and see based on some of the wording. So if we take a look here at set, and so it says over here, if this operation happens to run on the server, the results are set for later browser use. Okay, so this wording does not sound very scientific to me. If this operation happens to run on the server, something doesn't seem quite right. And also in terms of how they set it up here, um, they always set up a default. So we're going to try and get the warm-up data. But if we don't manage to get the warm-up data, then we fetch the data on the front end. Problem is, I don't think it will ever work in terms of getting the warm-up data. So yeah, that's why I chose to explore some other directions of improving performance and not using this API. But again, I might be wrong. I might have done something wrong in my setup. So I'd love to hear from anybody who has managed to get this running. And that's really all I have in terms of the rendering API and talking about client side versus server side rendering with Wix. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you next time. API, which is the warm-up data. So there are some, I'll just make note here that render cycle, warm-up data over here, these are all depreciated, but there's a new warm-up data API. And the way it works is that when we run the server side, so when we run the server side, we set data. So we can get certain data on the server and set it. And then once we load the front end of the website, we can get that data from the server. Okay, and it's done something like this. So you can see here that they've set up the get data function. And if it's in the back end, then they set up some warm-up data. And then on the front end, they get that warm-up data and they display it. So let's take a look and try using this warm-up data, and let's see if that improves our performance at all if we first get the query data in the back end and then load it using warm-up data in the front end. So in order to do this, we're going to need to load, let's see, we need to import wixWindow, but we also need to import, okay, only wixWindow, and then we could just tap into warm-up data. So let's try that. So I'm going to go back to our site, and what we're going to do here is instead of populating the repeater data over here, we're going to instead say wix, whoops, I want this to be in English. And now I'm in English, so wixWindow dot warmup data dot set, and let's call this mock data, and we're going to set it using the mock data. Okay, so we set our Wix our warm-up data over here. And again, we're only rendering this in the backend. So our load data, we're only rendering in the backend. And our load repeater, we're only going to be running in the front end. So I'm going to add an else clause over here. And our load repeater will be running in the front end. And essentially what we're going to be doing is this assigning of data we're going to do here inside of load repeater. And we have to get the mock data from the warm-up. So we're going to say wixWindow dot warmup data dot get, and we're getting essentially the same thing here. So it's going to be get mock data. And then we can assign this to a variable. So I'll say here const mock data equals wixWindow. And let's just make sure this is not a promise. So get, and it just returns it. Okay, so it doesn't return a promise, it just returns the data. So let's go back here. So let's recap what we're doing. We are running our load data function, and I'm actually going to move these consoles over here to our front end. And we can compare these load times to the load times that we were seeing before. So essentially what we're doing here is we are just in the backend, we're going to be loading the data. So we're querying the databases, and then we're setting the warm-up data. And then once we get to the front end, we're telling the repeater how to behave, and we're actually assigning the data that we got from the warm-up to the repeater. So let's go ahead and publish that, and let's see how that looks. So I'm going over here, and I'm going to refresh our site. And I'm going to refresh again. Okay, so load time was 3.1 milliseconds. And we got an error, so the data parameter that's passed the data method cannot be set to undefined. So that means that we must have had a problem here with the wixWindow.warmupdata.get. So let's add a console over here. So console.log mockup data, mock data. And let's see if we have any issues. Okay, so we're setting the mock data over here, exactly as they said over here, and they do something similar, so result.items. And here, so here they set a default, so basically, or sorry, a fallback. So if there's some problem getting the warm-up data, then they actually fetch the data from, from the collection. But I'm trying to think why this didn't work. Set data, and how did we? Yeah, so we did this right, it looks like. I don't see any issues in the code that we wrote over here. Okay, so let's try publishing this and running it again. Okay, so essentially our mock data is coming back undefined. So that means there must be some issue here with our wixWindow.warmUpData.set. Okay, so I see here it says if the query already ran on the server side and has returned data to the client side, by the time the line sets data results executes, then my warm-up data identifier exists and the client-side code does not have to perform the query again. Okay, so essentially what's probably happening here is that because we don't have a lot of code on our site, um, the server side and client side are both rendering quite fast. So the client side is rendering even before the server side rendering is even finished, or server side rendering isn't happening because possibly we cached, like Wix has cached some of the data from our previous renderings, so it doesn't feel the need to do that again. So what I'm going to try and do is load this page again in an incognito window and see if that has any effect on this. So what follows is what I'll call the bloopers, which is essentially me just trying to use this warm-up data API and being very hopeful that it will work and not succeeding. Again, I think that I did everything right. If you see that I did something wrong, please shout out in the comments. But yeah, this is the reason that I concluded that it doesn't work. So if you want to see that, keep on watching. So here I have an incognito tab, and I'm just going to paste our URL and give it a spin. So the heading, the text didn't load, which indicates that we're having a similar problem. And yeah, so we didn't get the warm-up data over here either. So I guess that means that there's just not enough time for Wix to process the server side and then catch that warm-up data and send it to our client side. So I'm going to do one more thing to try and test this warm-up data, and that is to create another page on our site, which we are going to navigate to first. And because Wix is a single page app, as I said, essentially when you visit the website, no matter which page you're visiting, it loads your entire site. So that means when we visit the first page's URL, the server side functions should start running. And then hopefully by the time I navigate to the second page, the data will already be loaded and we'll see it displayed. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to add another page to our site. And blank page, don't need anything fancy. And I'm going to make this page the home page. So I'm just going to make this the home page. And this page, let's see what the URL is. Change this to data. And SEO basics, just change this to data. And here on our new home page, we will add a button which will navigate to our data page. Go to data and add a link, and I'm going to choose the data page. So remember that essentially what Wix is doing is that the code here is actually being loaded server side even when I'm not navigating to this page. And what Wix is doing is just checking to see if anything here needs to go and be done on the server side. So theoretically, this load data should load as soon as I navigate to the home page. And then by the time I go to this data page, then it will be running this load repeater, which has the warm-up data. Let's see if that works. I'm going to go ahead and publish the site. And now I'm navigating to our new home page. If it lets me. Let me try and do a hard. Okay, great. We're at our new homepage. And now what I'm going to do is, okay, I'm on the homepage. I played around a bit. I looked at the homepage. It's very beautiful. And now I'm going to the data page. And mock data is still undefined, which I find rather surprising.